moved up or down yet. This is Andy Forsythe. Andy graduated from law school the same year I did, 78, and he's become an Austin institution. He graduated, went into private practice for a while, then went to work in the county attorney's office and was there for what seemed like years. But he finally moved up.
Years to me.
He moved up to the district attorney's office and spent years there. And now he's out in private practice and is with Gordon Rubinet now in Williamson. It's been in private practice for what seems like several years also. So anyway, if everything's okay, let me just talk to the videographer before we get started.
Okay.
You want to give him the ground rules?
Yeah, each of you want to limit it to 30 minutes, no more than 30 minutes?
Easily.
Okay. And I'll give you a 5-minute warning. Ready? Okay, we'll call for trial cause number 279423, the state of Texas versus Victor Alvarez. State ready?
State's ready.
Defense?
Defense ready, Your Honor.
State, you may proceed.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Denton. I'm an assistant county attorney over at Travis County Attorney, and it's going to be my duty over the next couple days to represent the people of the state of Texas in the trial of the state of Texas versus Victor Alvarez. Now, this is a DWI trial, so you know up front what sort of trial we're sitting on. And just so that you get some kind of feel for what jury duty is like, I noticed on none of your cards, none of you indicated that you had jury duty before. Let me tell you, it's not exactly like you see on some of the old movies or old Perry Masons. Like we both announced to, and the judge explained, this is probably going to be about a 2-day trial. And it's not going to be like you've seen in the movies where you get locked up overnight. You get to go home, and you'll just be instructed by the judge on how to conduct yourself between the days of the trial. But in any event, we don't think it's going to go much more than 2 days. So you can consider that and answer any of the questions we have. Now, this is the part of the trial where we get a chance to talk to one another. It's before the evidence actually gets put on, and it's a time for both Mr. Forsythe, the defense attorney, and myself to see how you feel about some of the fact issues, some of the kinds of laws that apply in a DWI, driving while intoxicated, case. Now, the reason that we need to do that is, of course, as the jurors, you're going to be the ones who are ultimately going to have to judge the evidence, the witnesses, weigh the credibility. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So, of course, it's going to be important to both defense and myself to see how you feel about some of these things, because when we're finished talking to you here, the kind of things you tell us are going to guide us in our decisions that will ultimately decide who the 6 folks are going to sit over here in the jury box and hear this case. And there are no really right answers, there are no really wrong answers. We're just looking for the way you feel about it. And because, of course, that's going to impact the way you look at some of the evidence. Sort of as an example, if I were sitting out there and you were up here asking me the questions, I'd have to be honest and tell you, yeah, I'm a prosecutor, and as a prosecutor, I've seen a lot of trials like this, and I've got a lot of sort of preconceived notions and feelings about the law, about different kinds of witnesses, things like that. And consequently, I'd have to tell you that, just to be up front so that you can make your decisions. And I'd just ask the same thing. Nothing special here, no magic answers. We will be talking about this in front of all these people that, of course, are strangers. Consequently, if we go into any area that, it strikes you as a little more personal, you'd like to maybe talk about it a little more in private, just let me know and we'll go up and stand in front of the judge, in front of the bench, and talk about it up there. Believe me, I'll do the same thing. Okay, with that sort of as the ground rules, let's talk about some of the things that we're going to be doing over the next couple days. And the first is, I think we've already mentioned, what's your job as a jury panel? And what are the kind of things you're going to have to do that are general to any kind of trial, to see how you feel about that. One thing, of course, is, I guess I ought to tell you right up front, sort of ease your minds. You're not expected to be lawyers to know the law. The judge is going to tell you at the end of the trial, in what we call a charge, what the law is that applies here. So that'll guide you. What your job is going to be is to listen to the evidence that comes out of the witness stand right over here and look at the pieces of evidence to get admitted into evidence, and weigh the credibility and make those kinds of decisions. Now, I know that a lot of people find it uncomfortable, have to be in a position to sit in judgment of other folks. So let me just start off by asking Ms. Ford, just tell me, how do you feel about having to sit on a jury, especially a criminal jury, and sit in judgment of somebody? How's that strike you?
I don't have any problem with it.
You think you're going to be able to, well, let's just ask it this way. Assuming that I meet the burden of proof that I have, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit with you, beyond a reasonable doubt, assuming you believe that in fact Mr. Alvarez is guilty of driving while intoxicated, how are you going to feel about having to stand up at the end and say, we find you guilty, and in fact you need to be punished for this crime? How's that strike you?
It's justice.
Something that needs to be done?
Right.
How about weighing the evidence of, or weighing the testimony of different witnesses? You know, trying to decide, well, sitting in judgment, who's telling the truth, who's not?
I feel like that's all a part of it.
Do you have any children?
No.
Does anybody on the panel have any children? Yes, sir. Is that Mr. Daly?
Yes, sir.
How many children do you have?
I have one.
How old?
He's 15.
Okay. Does he tell you stories and you have to kind of decide what's really going on when he comes in with an excuse for something that happened?
Well, I basically trust what he says.
Okay. So it's based on your experience with it, what you know about it, and things like that? You are going to hear a lot of people, and I need to tell you that up front. The state will be bringing police officers. We'll be bringing people from the police laboratory. And as I said, you're going to have to listen to that, plus any evidence that's put on by the defendant, and make that decision. And when I say weigh the credibility, what I mean by that is look at the motives they might have or might not have for testifying. Look at the condition or the position they were in to observe what happened, whether or not they were impaired in any way, whether they really saw what was going on. And have to decide between them. So Mr. Bird?
Yes.
How do you feel about that, having to kind of sort out between different people?
Well, I think, like you said, there's an experience factor where if you know someone, then they're going to be more believable than some others. But I think also just the way people present themselves. You know, you can sometimes see in somebody's eyes if they're giving you a line, or if they're really honest about what they're saying. But I think I can determine that based on what they say and based on what I see.
Mr. Burleson, let me ask you the same sort of question. It's kind of a difficult thing to do. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'd like to believe that I can trust anybody who says something to me, but I know that that's not true, that I can't always. And I believe that I can at least have some idea when they're not shooting straight at me.
Okay, what a lot of us have been talking about the last couple of minutes, of course, is, I guess, dishonesty. Mr. Daly, you think that maybe some other factors like their training or experience, things like that might affect their ability to recall what happened on a particular day? Would it make a difference, say, if, as an example, you were going to go out and buy some real estate, trying to decide whether it's a good investment or not? And I'll tell you right now, investment in real estate is not part of this trial. You had a couple people to talk to about whether or not it was a good deal. Say a prosecutor who's only done criminal law was telling you, well, whether it's a good deal or not, and the other person you talked to was a real estate lawyer who's made lots of money in investments. Do you think there's sort of an obvious choice to you might give a little more credibility to because of their experience and training? Okay, that's fair enough. What I've been leading up to and talking about the witnesses is it's probable that you will hear conflicting stories up here. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, the state has a burden that they have to meet, as it should in all criminal trials, and that's called beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, I'd already told you a little earlier that you'll get discharged, in which the judge will make a lot of definitions for you and tell you what the law is that applies. One of the things, however, that he's not going to define for you is what's beyond a reasonable doubt mean. I don't have a pat answer to give you, and I suggest there's not a real pat answer, something each and every one of you are going to have to deal with if you get a chance to sit on the jury. However, I would suggest it's not, again, I refer to some of the old TV shows and whatnot, it's not like beyond all doubt or beyond no doubt. There's nothing magic about it. It's just like it implies, a reasonable doubt. You use your plain old common sense, listen to all the facts, and decide. The term beyond a reasonable doubt you see a lot in movies and whatnot. Let me start down the line and kind of ask how you feel, Mr. Byrd, about what beyond a reasonable doubt is. What kind of burden is that for the state to meet in your opinion?
I think it's going to be, like you said again, like on an individual basis, it's going to be the type of burden where the state has to convince me, has to convince each person by what they show me, as to whether it's high or low. I think that's going to depend on the case and what we see before us. I think some cases are going to be a lot more clear-cut than others.
Sure.
It's going to be easier to determine that.
Well, let me just ask you this, sir. Well, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Let me ask you this. Do you think beyond a reasonable doubt is the kind of burden that the state can almost never meet, or is it something that's obtainable? Could you hear, for instance, a conflicting story? Just because I said the light was red and Ms. Forsythe said that it was green, would that automatically cause reasonable doubt in your mind and you couldn't find beyond a reasonable doubt?
No, I think beyond a reasonable doubt can be proven even if there's conflicting stories. The state can meet that burden by, again, showing that a particular witness is more credible than another witness.
Ms. Ford, let me ask you the same thing. Confronted with conflicting testimony, say completely different testimony, how would that impact on your feeling about what reasonable doubt is beyond a reasonable doubt, the burden I have to live with?
I think you can find reasonable doubt even with conflicting stories.
But you can find reasonable doubt, or can you find beyond a reasonable doubt after listening to both people talk?
You could find beyond a reasonable doubt.
And by that, how do you mean? By weighing the testimony of the different folks?
And the credibility and the reason for their testifying.
Okay. Since time's limited, let's go ahead and move on to one of the other general areas that apply to all criminal trials, and that is a couple of the basic rights that are held by anyone, but most specifically the defendant who comes into court. One of the things that you hear very often is the presumption of innocence. Mr. Burleson, what's that mean to you? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Presumption of innocence is that I have to wait and see what comes out, what evidence there is, and if it doesn't look like, if I don't see enough evidence to know what's what, then the defendant has to go free.
Okay, so by saying you have to wait till you hear the evidence, would it be fair then to say presumption of innocence is sort of a starting point?
Yeah, something like that.
So if we all took a vote right now on guilt, or whether the defendant is not guilty or guilty, we'd have to say not guilty because there hadn't been any evidence, right?
That's right.
Okay. Mr. Daly, so I have the name straight this time. Let's talk about the same thing. Presumption of innocence. What's that mean to you?
Well, that's a tough one. I would have to say that presumption of innocence means what I've always heard, innocent till proven guilty.
How does that match with what Mr. Burleson was talking about earlier? After you hear the evidence that may or may not change your mind, or is this something that, just how do you feel about that?
It may change my mind. If I think the guy did it, then I think he's guilty.
Okay. Because, well, one of the things we talked about a little bit earlier that I think ties in right here, it's a good place, to talk about the testimony. Presumption of innocence, I would submit, is, as you've already told us, sort of a starting place. Right now there has not been any evidence introduced, and that's a starting place on the guilt or innocence phase. However, if the defendant chooses to testify, and he has that absolute right to testify if he chooses, the presumption of innocence is not a presumption of truth-telling. I would submit that his testimony has to be weighed like anyone else's. Motives, ability to observe what was going on that evening, the whole gamut of the things we talked about a little bit earlier. Mr. Bird, how's that strike you? Does that sound about right, or what do you think?
Well, to me, it means that all of us are innocent of any crime until we're brought into a court and charged with a particular crime, and the state proves that we've committed something. To me, it means that you can't just be snatched off of the street and thrown in jail for something like in some countries. And it's something to protect each one of us. But I don't think it's going to make the defendant's testimony on the stand any more believable. I think that his testimony is going to have to live up to the same scrutiny as anyone else's.
That brings up another point. Mr. Daly, I noticed from your card that you have a relative who's in a police agency.
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
That is my brother.
How long has he been on the police force?
Oh, about as long as I can remember, I guess.
Whereabouts?
20 years.
How's that going to affect your listening to evidence today? And I've already told you I'm going to put a police officer on the stand.
Well, I'll look at him as I would, I think any other individual.
Okay. If they're good officers or bad officers, you'll listen to what you hear, and
Well, I believe police officers are trained in these matters, and then take that into consideration.
okay. Sort of as a fact on what sort of observations they'll make out at the scene. Is that fair? Am I reading you right? I don't know.
I don't think I understand the question.
Okay, well, that's quite possible. Sometimes you might have to help me along on this because I might not ask it right. I guess you've got some experience, obviously, talking to your brother. He's been on a police force for some time. That's not, if I understand your answer right, that's not going to predispose, I can't even talk today. You're not going to already have made up your mind just because your brother is an officer.
You mean would I be predisposed?
Yes.
No.
Okay, all right. Thanks for helping me out there. I appreciate that. Well, good. We bandied about a lot of things that are sort of general in nature on all trials. Let's talk about this one in specifically. I told you this is a DWI, driving while intoxicated. And driving while intoxicated has several elements. And to those elements, the burden of proof applies to the state. I have to prove each one of those elements to you beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's go over those elements and see how they strike you. The state has to prove that the defendant, Mr. Alvarez, was in fact driving or operating a motor vehicle here in Travis County, Texas on the date that we've alleged, on or about the date we've alleged, in a public place while intoxicated. Those are all the elements, however, that the state has to prove. Mr. Byrd, how does that strike you? Do you think that's sufficient, or should the state be forced to prove more than that for conviction on driving while intoxicated?
Well, I guess probably the most important one is that you prove he's intoxicated.
Right.
But I guess if that's what the law says that you have to prove, I think that is sufficient. If those three elements is what the state has to prove, I don't believe they have to prove anything else, anything beyond that.
Well, as an example, you have to be driving or operating a motor vehicle. Would you require the state to show particularly bad driving, a horrendous traffic offense of some sort?
Not if the person was drunk, because if they're drunk, when you're drinking, you could have problems driving at any moment, and it doesn't have to be followed by some sort of erratic driving.
Okay. Ms. Ford, let me ask you the same question. How do you feel with those elements being the only elements, driving while intoxicated? You think that's sufficient? Do you think we probably ought to bring you more?
No, I think that's sufficient.
What about before we actually get into the definition of intoxication, would you require the state to show you that he was drinking while he was driving, as an example?
No.
How about the amount that he had to drink, the number of drinks he had, what kind he had to drink?
I'd be interested to know that.
Okay. How do you weigh that? Let me ask then, with the idea, of course, that the state doesn't walk with us all the time, so it's kind of, the state may not be able to bring you evidence other than from the defense evidence, how much or what the defendant consumed that day or preceding the stop by the officer. With that, how's that strike you?
Well, I'd want to, however you could prove that, in my mind, that he was drunk, I'd have to be assured that he was drunk.
Okay. You bring up a real interesting point then, and it's the next point I think we ought to talk about, the kind of evidence that will be presented and how it strikes you. I suspect part of the evidence that you'll hear will be opinion testimony from people on the scene, specifically police officers. How do you feel about having to make the kind of decisions we've talked about all evening on opinion testimony? Someone saying someone else was intoxicated.
Well, it would just depend on how I felt about that person, what he based that on, or, how he, it goes into everything, just judging an individual.
Okay. It's a fair answer. Mr. Daly, have you ever seen a car out on the road you thought was being driven by someone who was intoxicated?
I've seen plenty of them.
Okay, what are the kind of things that you see in that particular vehicle that made you think it's being driven by a DWI driver?
Well, all kinds of things. Swerving on the road. I see those young kids flying down the road. Some accidents, I'm sure, were caused by people who were drinking. Things of that nature.
Mr. Burleson, how about you? Have you ever seen vehicles out there on the road that you thought were being driven by someone who was intoxicated?
Couple times. Actually, most of the cars that I thought were being driven by drunks weren't on the road anymore.
You see after the fact?
Yeah.
What are the kind of things that would lead you to believe the vehicles you have seen on the road were being driven by intoxicated people?
Well, going like this in the lane.
Swerving?
Swerving around. Coming to an intersection and not knowing what to do. Things like that.
Well, that leads into something else, sir. Have you ever seen folks not behind the wheel that you thought were intoxicated?
5 minutes.
What are the kind of things that made you think they were intoxicated?
Well, their breath when they got close to me and talking real loud.
Balance?
Balance.
How about the physical characteristics? What kind of things that you see on them?
I tried not to look too much.
A little sloppy maybe?
Yeah, something like that.
Think their eyes are affected? Get a little bloodshot?
They probably do.
Let's move on to another area. We are talking about a driving while intoxicated case. Is there anyone on the panel who either themselves or someone they know, close friend or relative, has ever been stopped for driving while intoxicated? Anyone at all? Yes, sir. Who is it that's been stopped? Friend? Relative?
Well, I was stopped once.
All right. Would you like to talk about it in front of the judge, or do you feel comfortable talking about it here?
Cast out of the bag.
All right, sir. Well, tell me, how does that affect you sitting on this kind of jury?
Well, I wasn't drunk then, and I'm sure there's people that get pulled over that aren't drunk, like myself.
And after you got stopped, what happened, sir? Were you taken down to the station?
Sure was.
Did you have to submit to some other sort of test other than test out on the side of the road?
Submitted to a breath test.
Okay. And then what happened after the breath test? Were you released?
I was released because it showed that I wasn't drunk.
Okay. So in other words, what I hear you say is after a stop by an officer who had suspicion in any event in his mind that you might be intoxicated, he asked you to submit to a breath test of some sort?
That's what I said.
And then afterwards, you got released because once the officer saw the results of the instrument, in essence, cut you free.
That's right.
Okay. There will be an intoxilizer in the case that you will be hearing, which is a breath test. Other than Mr. Bird, who's had some experience with that, is there anyone else here who has had some experience or read some articles about the intoxilizer, an instrument to measure alcohol concentration in your breath? Anyone at all? Okay, let's very briefly look at intoxication. That's defined as someone who has lost their normal or has lost the normal use of their mental or physical faculties by alcohol that they've consumed, or if they have a blood alcohol or breath concentration of 0.10 or greater. So essentially 3 ways, all separate. It's not like 3 rungs of a ladder that the state has to prove 2 of 3 or 3 of the 3 or this one and one of the other 2. 3 separate ways. In the brief time we have left, Ms. Ford, how's that strike you? What do you think about that as a definition of intoxication?
What was the second one?
If someone's lost their normal use of their mental faculties or their physical faculties, I'm not sure what order I put them in,
Okay.
or they have a concentration of 0.10 or greater. Have you seen people who you thought were affected by alcohol to the point that it affected them mentally, say their judgment as an example?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you think that that's a fair line or definition to use on whether someone is intoxicated?
Yeah, as long as it's enough. As long as they lost enough of their faculties.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Enough to be drunk
Okay.
or intoxicated.
Well, that's a very interesting point. There is not a law in Texas against drunk driving. The law is against someone who drives while intoxicated. Okay, and I know often, at least in Bahia where I'm from, when you talk about somebody being drunk, I think the old way they talked about was wall walking drunk. You know, so intoxicated, past intoxication, that just, you know, blind. Do you think there's some point before that point that you are impaired, you're not up to normal speed either mentally or physically because of alcohol?
Yeah, but you know, there's also a point where you have some drinks and you're not intoxicated.
Okay, all right. Mr. Burleson, you talked about earlier seeing folks who had, you thought were intoxicated outside of their vehicle, and you went through some of the kind of characteristics that you saw. How do you feel about the definition based on someone who's physically or mentally impaired by alcohol? that seem to match the kind of observations you were just telling us about?
Well, yeah, I guess so. Seems about as good as anybody can do.
Okay,
Mr. Denton, would you wrap it up, please?
thank you. Let me just ask briefly here, we spent a lot of time going through a lot of areas. I told you this is a 2-day trial. Is there anyone who, because I didn't ask the right question and get out the kind of response that would let me know, is there anyone on the jury at all who's got some sort of pressing problem or something on the back of their mind that weighs on their mind that's going to affect them so they won't be able to give their full attention to the next 2 to 3 days in the jury trial, so that they couldn't give a fair trial to both the state as well as the defense? Anyone at all? Okay, since I don't see anyone responding to that, thank you very much for your time, and I think Mr. Forsythe has several questions to ask you now. Thank you.
May it please the court, counsel for the state. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andy Forsythe. I represent Victor Alvarez, the defendant seated here. It is my turn to ask you a few questions and probe into your minds a little bit. Some of the things that Mr. Denton has got into are things that I would have, so we can say that and kind of get to the heart of the matter. One thing that hasn't been brought up is the fact that Mr. Alvarez is a student at the University of Texas, and he is from Nicaragua. He is here as a foreign exchange student. Let me ask you right off the bat, is there anybody who believes or feels in their heart right now that because Mr. Alvarez is from Nicaragua that somehow, perhaps not being a citizen, he doesn't deserve to enjoy the same rights that all of us do as American citizens? Anybody feel that? Well, the law is very clear. If you're here in our country, of course, you do get to enjoy exactly the same rights. In fact, as you are probably aware, this trial means so much more to Mr. Alvarez than it would even to one of us, because if he were found guilty of something that he believes he's not guilty of, it could affect his chances of ever being a citizen of this country, which is his fondest hope. Now, with that in mind, is there anybody here who right now, for whatever reason, feels some opinion or has some conclusion already as to the guilt or the innocence of Mr. Alvarez? Something that you heard Mr. Denton say, or some general notion that you have, well, he's been charged, so he must be guilty. That kind of an attitude. Okay. Mr. Byrd, you have already been candid with the jury panel and said that you were stopped once and an officer accused you of being DWI. Is that correct?
That's right.
Told you he thought you'd had too much to drink to be driving, arrested you for DWI and took you into the police station, correct?
First told me how to blinker out and then decided.
Then decided you were DWI.
Yeah.
What police force was he on?
I
Remember?
think it was Austin.
The Austin Police Department. Okay. He took you into the police station, you took a breathalyzer test, you passed that and they let you go. Correct?
Yeah.
What would have happened, you suppose, if that breathalyzer incorrectly had indicated that you were intoxicated?
I would have got a lawyer.
Okay. Would that have changed your own opinion as to the fact that you were or were not intoxicated?
Oh, I'm sure to an extent, but
Did you feel you were
that night I
intoxicated?
wasn't.
Sir?
That night I wasn't.
We're not intoxicated. Okay.
But I'm sure had I seen that number, I might have thought about it a little bit differently.
Okay. And if after seeing that number you were still convinced that they were wrong and you were not intoxicated, would you have fought the case?
Sure.
Do you think there's anything wrong with hiring a lawyer and coming into court saying not guilty?
No.
Is
No,
anything
because
un-American in that?
well, I think alcohol affects different people different ways.
Okay.
And I'm sure that might have something to do with the way they measure it.
Do you feel like a person's intoxication is best judged by someone who knows that person or someone who's never met him before?
Oh, probably someone that knows that person, I would think.
Mr. Daly, would you agree with that?
I would say by somebody who knows him.
Your 15-year-old son, does he ever drink, either with or without your permission?
Never.
Do you think if he had something to drink or perhaps a little too much, you'd be able to tell it?
Definitely.
You think you'd be able to pick up on that more quickly than someone who'd never seen him before or since?
I think so.
Mr. Burleson, you're a student here at UT?
That's right.
Have you ever had any encounters with the University of Texas Police Department?
No, I waved to him, but that's about it.
Okay. Good, on good terms with them?
Yeah,
They've never cited you for any kind of traffic infraction?
parking once. Nothing.
Ms. Ford, have you ever gotten a traffic ticket?
No.
Who on the panel's got a traffic ticket? Well, you're always in trouble, aren't you, Mr. Burleson? You ever got a traffic ticket you disagreed with?
I guess not. There's some I wish that didn't happen, but I guess there.
It just didn't happen?
No, there's some that I wish had never
It
happened.
never happened.
Yeah, but I guess most of them are pretty justified, I'd say.
How about you, Mr. Daly? Ever gotten a ticket you disagreed with?
I really don't remember. I was kind of a young kid, so I probably deserved it at those times.
Mr. Burleson, you ever had a ticket you disagreed with? Who here has ever had a disagreement with a police officer over anything? Any kind of discussion? You all are fine citizens, let me say that. Who here has ever heard that policemen are under a certain amount of pressure to make a certain number of arrests? Or to give a certain number of tickets? Anybody ever heard anything like that? Mr. Burleson, you've heard of a quota for tickets, something like that? You think a policeman would ever admit that he was under some sort of pressure to put out that many tickets?
I doubt that they would admit it, but I didn't hear that they were for like DWIs. I heard they were just for traffic violations that were easy money.
Have you heard about the recent crackdown on DWI in Austin, Travis County, Texas?
Yes.
Do you think that might put some type of pressure on police officers to make more arrests for DWI? You think it's conceivable that could look good on their statistics?
I suppose it would look good, but then I think it'd look awfully bad if they made a bunch of arrests that were wrong also.
Okay. And the way you tell that is by what a jury says at the end of the evidence, correct?
Yeah.
Ms. Ford, did you understand from what the prosecutor said that it is not illegal in Texas to have a drink and then go out and drive your car? Or do you understand that?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you understand that it's not illegal, in fact, until September 1st of this year, to have a drink in your car with you as you drive, as long as you're not intoxicated?
Right.
Okay. There's been some controversy about that. A new law has been passed, the open container law, and after September the 1st, you can't go out to the lake and come back with a beer in your hand. That's just illegal. Are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
But do you understand that at the time Mr. Alvarez was arrested, the law as it stands now was in effect? And the mere fact that you might have a beer with you at the time that you're driving does not mean that you're guilty of DWI, and in fact is not illegal at all. Do you understand?
Yes.
Is that all right with you?
Yes.
You live by that law? Okay. Who on the jury panel doesn't drink at all? Should have known. Mr. Burleson, why do you not drink, sir? Is it just personal preference, religious, health?
I have personal preference. I don't care to. I don't want to take the chance of being alcoholic.
Okay.
Anything like that.
Mr. Daly, how about you?
I just don't see any reason to do it.
All right. Mr. Daly, do you feel any prejudice in yourself, in all honesty, in judging a person that's accused of DWI who freely admits that he had some drinks, he simply wasn't intoxicated?
Well, to be honest, I don't think that other people, that anybody should drink.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I'm not going to say that somebody is guilty of a crime because he drank.
Are you predisposed because of your feelings against drinking in general, against the defendant in the DWI case? In other words, would you give Victor Alvarez in the DWI case the same consideration you would a person accused of running a stop sign?
I would think so.
Don't have any problem, Mr. Burleson? Same with you? All right. Now, Ms. Ford, do you speak Russian?
No.
Have you ever spoken to an intoxicated person?
Yes.
You've heard them speak. Can you sometimes detect slurring or mush mouth, a way of talking in their speech that gives you some clue that they're intoxicated? Has it been fairly easy for you to pick up?
In combination with other things, yes.
With other things? Okay. You say you don't speak Russian.
No.
Do you think you'd be able to tell if a person that was speaking Russian to you was speaking in a normal fashion or if they were speaking in a slurred fashion?
Yeah, I think I could.
You think you could tell? How about you, Mr. Daly? You're from Maine, aren't you? Is that right?
Yeah.
You speak Japanese?
No, sir.
You think if a Japanese person was speaking to you in their native tongue that you could tell if they were slurring their speech?
I suppose so.
Okay. How about you, Mr. Bird? Let me ask it to you a little bit different. Let's say a person from a foreign country was speaking to you in English but with a heavy accent. Would that make it more or less difficult for you to detect whether or not they were slurring their speech?
Well, I guess if it was an Oriental and they ever slowed down, you'd notice. But I guess if it were someone from some other country, it might be a little hard because you don't understand it in the first place.
Do you have any problem, Mr. Bird, with the fact that Victor Alvarez is here on a student permit and is not a citizen of the United States? Does that cause you to feel one way or the other about his possible guilt or innocence?
Well, if it were any kind of driving problem, I don't know anything about the case, but I don't think the foreign students are very good drivers.
Okay. Do you think foreign students drink more or less than the average American citizen?
I have no idea.
So if a foreign student committed some traffic errors, it's probably more likely, or could be more likely, that it was just because they're bad drivers. Is that true? Possible?
I don't know. I'm sure some of them drink as much as anybody in Texas.
You've seen foreign students commit some kind of traffic errors, I suppose.
Just don't seem to know where they're going.
Mr. Burleson, have you ever not completely stopped at a stop sign?
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever cut a corner a little bit too fast? Okay. Were you intoxicated when you did those things?
I don't drink.
You don't drink at all, do you? Okay. Did you get tickets for those?
No.
You've seen people that you believe were intoxicated driving cars?
A few times, yeah.
Were the cars weaving at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that one of the things that you've most often noticed about cars being driven by people that are intoxicated, the weaving?
Well, of course, if they're in another car and I don't know them, I have no idea whether they're intoxicated. And then every once in a while, I catch myself weaving a little bit too.
Sure.
But when I see somebody who really, for quite a while, can't stay in his lane, then I think.
Okay. Mr. Daly, if you were asked to, as you may well be on a jury to judge someone's guilt or innocence of a crime, are you the kind of person that would want to know as much as you could about what was going on at the time this person was supposedly guilty of some offense?
Yes, sir.
Would you want to know it all?
Yes, sir.
All right. If there were several police officers who are charged with enforcing our laws, who are in a position to observe the person being accused, would you want them to be observing and finding out everything they could about that offense so they could come into court and tell you about it?
Yes, sir.
If you had a person that was charged with DWI, would you agree with me that whether or not they were intoxicated is probably the key issue in the case? Let me make it that easy for you. That's going to be the only issue in this case. There's no question Victor Alvarez was driving a motor vehicle on a public road in Travis County, Texas. The only issue is whether or not he was intoxicated, and we say he was not. Okay? Are you with me so far?
Yes, sir.
Now, understanding that, if there were several police officers in a position to observe him and decide whether or not he was intoxicated from his actions, his speech, that sort of thing, would you want them to do so?
Yes, I would.
Would you think that would be good police work for each one of them to observe everything they could about him and come to his or her own individual conclusion about whether or not that person was intoxicated?
Well, it depends how many you're talking about. One or two may be sufficient.
We're not talking about the whole police force. If there was 3 or 4 out there, you think they should all form an opinion?
No, not necessarily.
Just one's enough for you?
One, if they were all within I don't think it takes 4 police officers to stop somebody. I think it takes 1. And if he's in a position to observe that person, then he should go ahead and do that. I think it would be a waste of time to have all 4.
Okay. How about 2?
Again, if 2 police officers are in the car and there's nothing else they can be doing at the time, then they should both observe him. Otherwise, he doesn't need to call in another police car to observe someone for DWI.
Okay. Ms. Ford, what have you heard about the intoxilizer machine?
Not much.
Haven't heard much about it at all? Mr. Bird has had some personal experience. Have either of you gentlemen on the back row heard anything about the intoxilizer?
Is it? It's different from the breathalyzer?
I think I've been talking about both. I don't know which one we're using here. Let's say the intoxilizer. Have you heard anything about it?
No.
You have, Mr. Daly?
Not too much. I just know that it's the breath test to determine your blood alcohol content.
Okay. You don't drink, so I can't really pick on you. Ms. Ford, do you drink socially?
Social.
Okay. Have you had a couple of drinks before at a social occasion and then driven a car?
Yes.
Were you in control of your mental and physical faculties at the time you did that?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a question cold, and since you don't know much about the intoxilizer, this may not be fair, but I want to get your reaction. Let's say that you have had 3 drinks over the course of a party during the evening. You get out and are driving your car home and you're stopped by a policeman. All right? Let's assume further that you know that you are not intoxicated, that you have definitely been drinking. Perhaps you haven't had too much to eat either, but you are not intoxicated. You're in control of your normal mental and physical faculties, okay? And a police officer says, all right, Ms. Ford, you can take an intoxilizer test to determine whether or not you're intoxicated, or you cannot. It's your choice. And you know you've been drinking, but you know you're not intoxicated. Would you take the test?
If I really believed I wasn't intoxicated, I would.
Okay. You would put your faith in that test.
Well, I put my faith in my judgment that I knew I wasn't drunk. I mean, I don't know how they work or anything, but
What if the test was wrong?
I'd be in trouble.
You'd be in trouble, wouldn't you? Yeah. Now, let's take it one step further. Same mindset with you. You know you're not intoxicated, but you know you've had some drinks. You know you're facing policemen and a possible trial down the road, and the policeman says to you, Ms. Ford, you're arrested for DWI. We're going to the police station, and you've got a choice. You can either take an intoxilizer test. It'll determine, at least we say it'll determine how much alcohol is in your blood, or we can put you in a room with a video camera and a microphone and ask you to walk a line and say your alphabet, answer some questions, do some agility tests to show whether or not you have control of you have the use of your normal mental and physical faculties. And that tape will be preserved, and it can be shown to your lawyer, to prosecutors, to a judge or a jury down the road. And you have your choice. Which way would you go?
I'd go the videotape.
Why?
Because if I really thought I wasn't drunk, I'd trust myself on a tape a lot more than I'd trust a machine.
If you were sitting on this jury in judgment of somebody that the police have accused of being intoxicated, would you want to see such a videotape of that person?
Yes.
And if the police had available to them such a video room and a microphone where they could easily take that person in and run them through all those tests to show it to you as a juror, would you want the police to do that?
Yes.
Ms. Ford, you are married to an attorney?
Yes.
Does he do any kind of criminal work?
He works at the AG's office.
What does he do for them?
He represents the state in the habeas corpus action.
Okay. Do you think of him as a prosecutor?
No, it's more paperwork. But
Does the fact that he does that make you feel that you're predisposed to favor Mr. Denton here in his case because he represents the state of Texas here?
no, not at all.
Okay, that wouldn't affect you at all. All right. You have been a witness in a criminal case or a witness in a case?
Yes, I have.
What was that all about?
It was an assault case in a bar.
Okay. Who called you as a witness?
The state.
The state did. Anything about that experience that would have any impact on your service as a juror in this case?
No.
You simply told what you saw, I guess.
Yeah,
Did you see somebody assault somebody else?
yes.
Did you have to form an opinion as to it, or was it just, I saw him hit somebody?
It was just what I saw, the events leading up to it. I guess I formed an opinion, but
Okay. Mr. Daly, I know that you said you had, was it a brother that's a police officer?
Yes, sir.
And on what police force does he work?
He's with the Department of Public Safety, Highway Patrol.
Highway Patrol. You talk to him very often about your work? I'm sorry, about his work?
Yes, we do.
Okay. He's pretty proud of being is he a highway patrolman?
Yeah, it's a good one.
Okay. Pretty proud of the DPS. Are you somewhat familiar with the amount of training that they go through in order to be a trooper?
Yes, I am.
Fairly extensive, is it not?
Yes,
Would you agree with me that they're considered kind of the cream of the crop of law enforcement officers in this state?
I think so.
Okay. He ever talked to you about UTPD, University of Texas Police Department, and what kind of reputation they have around the community for being professional policemen?
Years ago, he brought it up once, but other than that, no.
What do you say about it?
He just, he kind of laughed at the training they go through. He doesn't really consider them policemen.
Mr. Daly, you understand that in this case, the police officers with the UTPD will get up, or at least one of them will, and express their opinion as to Mr. Alvarez's state of intoxication, which we disagree with. You understand that?
Yes, sir.
You understand that I will ask him questions or cross-examine him very closely about what he observed and why he says what he says, the basis of his opinion, as well as his training and qualifications as an officer. Do you understand that? Does it offend you or bother you in any way that he will be subjected to that kind of question?
No.
Finally, Ms. Ford, let me ask you. You say you don't know much at this point about the intoxilizer, correct? Are you willing to go into this trial with an open mind and listen to whatever its virtues and vices may be?
yes.
Okay. Keep an open mind as to whether or not it's an effective and accurate machine. Okay. Have you ever had the experience of taking your car to a mechanic to be fixed for some specific problem? And when you get home, maybe the next day, it starts doing it all over again. And this was after that expert, that car mechanic that knows much more about that car than you, correct? Told you, assured you, as he was taking your money, that that car was fixed and that problem was gone.
Yeah, definitely.
And then you take it back to him the next day, and what does he say when you tell him it's still broken?
Tries again.
Just tries it again. All right. Thank y'all very much for your time. I appreciate it. This is going to be a very serious jury duty for those of you who get to serve in the end because of the important consequences that it's going to have for Mr. Alvarez. We thank you in advance for your time and your diligence.
Chuck.
I think it would be real helpful if each of you would tell us what it is that you're trying to achieve. In other words, we've seen what you've done, but what's going on, what objectives you have in your board are. Mike?
Well, of course, I'm probably the least experienced of all the attorneys in the room, and I've kind of changed in a little bit of time I've been out on voir dire. I kind of think when I first left law school, because all the competitions and whatnot, I kind of thought voir dire was really an extension of your opening statement, a chance to make a little bit more argument and whatnot. And there's probably, I think, still a little bit of that element. But I kind of think the most important part is to get the poison out. Obviously, if there's a single ringer on there, you're going to get at best a hung jury. You're certainly not going to win. So it seems to me the number one thing, I'm looking for the kind of experiences and statements that would make me think that despite what evidence I put on, chances are they're going to be coming up not guilty. I guess it's a general statement, but my main thing is looking for ringers on there, because if I don't get them off, I've lost.
what are you looking for in ringers? How do you try and identify ringers?
One of it, of course, is preparation on the case. You know what your facts are. You know who your witnesses are. You know if you've got good witnesses or questionable ones, like I'm going to have in this one probably. Sort of even though, you can't ask anyone, well, you're going to be fair and impartial, because of course everybody always says yes. I mean, that's kind of a wasted question. So what you're looking for, at least what I'm looking for, is just the way they act, not necessarily what they answer, although that's probably number one, but the way they respond to me, whether, a lot of it's sort of a gut feel, whether I think they're against my case. I don't know how to better explain it.
Anything else you can add that you think might be useful for the students?
Nothing offhand, maybe with a question, but
Andrew?
I think the best thing you can do as a defense lawyer is try to stop the momentum. I think in any kind of criminal case, there is a natural momentum with the state. The guy is already arrested, he goes into court, he's charged, and let's find him guilty and go home. I mean, I think people kind of want to do that. I think we all have that desire sort of to please, and I think the way you please in a criminal case as a juror is to find somebody guilty. That's the way we think of it. And I think a defense lawyer's job is to make the environment sit up and kind of notice what's going on from the very beginning. To say, gee, it's not that easy, it's not that simple. I think prosecutors like it simple, defense lawyers like it complicated. There's things to think about here. Ooh, there's issues. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, well, maybe so. And you kind of get the wheels going in their minds that it's not just an open and shut. The cop says he's guilty. It's over. You get them thinking about that. The other purposes Mike alluded to are just exactly right. You want to get the ringers off. You want to brainwash the panel a little bit as to your theory of the case. And you want to get them committed to following whatever laws are in your favor. If there's a tough law that they might not really like, you can use that real fruitfully to get challenges for cause. In a confession case, where there might be a technical problem with the Miranda warnings, a lot of people are amazed to know that if you find a violation there, you have to disregard the whole confession. And a lot of honest people will say, well, I couldn't do that. I just couldn't follow that law, and you can get them for cause. And the rest of them you've got committed in. But those are the purposes I see.
Got any questions?
If you had one apiece.
It's all horrible. Y'all are tough.
it's kind of hard because they're not the people represented by the cards, so
Yeah,
the kind of clues you get from the real person who was a parent with kids, and you could ask them, well, what do you tell your kids about drinking and driving? Instead of having you make it up. You get some feedback you really can't get here, so it's kind of a guess,
It is a tough guess. I'd like to strike about 3 or 4 of you myself. I might have struck you simply because that experience with the intoxilizer, which really is a real big key in this case, and we probably didn't talk about it as much as we otherwise would have, it kind of vindicated your deal. You didn't think you were guilty, and the intoxilizer showed you weren't, so you may be a big, proponent of that. Plus, you showed some good redneck qualities there and talking about the Orientals and all that kind of stuff, and I got a Nicaraguan guy here. So you may have gone, although of course I would have liked to have gotten rid of Daly back there. He gave me a bunch of grief, but his brother does know that UTPD guys are kind of clowns, so that's good. And you'd be my first choice, I guess, then, David.
Got a question after that?
Yeah, I had a question on the prior experience with the intoxilizer. You didn't ask what level his reading on the intoxilizer was. Is there a reason for that? I think we know the fact before that it was 0.9, and it seems to me that just a fraction off. If that thing had screwed up even a little bit, you would be in this court instead of this other guy.
Good point. Could have done that.
Was there any?
But from my side, as long as it blew less than 1.0, and I could point out that, see, you got cut loose because it was less than 1.0, isn't it fair and honest and a good machine?
Yeah.
But you have to go through the evaluation process on it.
Is that something you're going to do in front of the whole jury, or when he said that there was somebody that he knew you went?
No, but this is kind of a little artificial, I guess. I knew we weren't going to go in front of the bench. I knew.
No, right, he was supposed to stand up and make a he was before the bench. But is it something you would not have continued that line of questioning there in front of, would have gone before the
Oh, probably. As soon as you knew that he'd been arrested. And
A nice way to do that is to say, is there anybody here who either themselves or a family member or a friend has been arrested for DWI? Give them a way out so it doesn't.
And as soon as they raise their hand and take them up,
That's
they'll let her
right.
know with them. But this is a little different, so why not?
You were very, kind of non-direct in asking about the possible, prejudice because he was a foreign, just said, was a foreign student and all like that. Do you think that approach works better than asking more directly, because I assume he's Hispanic because of the name, where it comes from, asking if the fact that he does have an accent and he, is Hispanic, if that would cause a problem?
That's a real sensitive issue, a real important issue, and that's one that you would think about a lot before you actually did a voir dire. I thought about this for 15 minutes before I did it, so that probably wasn't a very good presentation on my part. I think you could do it either way. If you really wanted to get an honest answer, you'd have to go at it obliquely. Instead of saying because he's Hispanic or foreign, you might say something about, I don't know, the fact that he's here on a visa would that, make you think that maybe he should obey the law more carefully than somebody else or something. You might get a more honest answer. On the other hand, if you want to just go ahead and commit everybody and try to brainwash them and go, of course the fact that he's from Nicaragua, none of you would let that interfere in your deal and get everybody committed to that. So it depends on what you're trying for. If you're really trying to get them or you're just trying to bind them to being good guys.
In fact, you might, in this case, try to get them to discuss a little bit about what's going on in Nicaragua, because one of the facts in this case was that he started crying and so forth, and there was a good opportunity that he was afraid of the police. And if he's coming from Nicaragua, he's got good reason to be afraid of people who are in uniform. And you can bring those facts out and get the jurors to discuss that. And then when they see it in the evidence, it can be explained later in argument if they don't see it immediately anyway.
Any other questions?
Yeah, what happens is it a personal error if you find out, or is it a mistrial error if you find out maybe one of the jurors has lied about something material?
If you find out that one of the jurors has lied about something material, it depends on what it is. If they've lied about whether they're a felon, then it probably is. The truth of the matter is that a poll done by the RAND Corporation, extremely conservative corporation, of people who had actually served on criminal juries, showed that 33% of the jurors lied to the lawyers on voir dire. Those are the ones that admitted it. So the fact is that jurors lie to lawyers all the time during voir dire. And the reason for that mainly is because lawyers set them up to lie. We ask them close-ended questions that they get patterned. Lawyers have a tendency to pattern jurors how to answer questions safely. So the jury panel usually figures out in the first 5 minutes of the voir dire how to hide. And that's why we get lied to. We'll talk about that some next week. We're going to have a longer discussion on voir dire techniques. When they aren't here and we can really pick them apart. Say what we really think about what they did.
By the way, I didn't mean to so totally malign the UTPD. And some of the officers are very nice guys, good guys, become good cops with APD and everything else, but they do have kind of a reputation around the courthouse for making a traffic stop into a riot. A good way of doing that.
This is to each of y'all. How, if y'all are questioning a juror and you start getting indications that possibly this would be a good one for you, how aware are y'all of the opposing attorney and you perhaps want to back off or stop before you think you'll show the possible juror to be too good for you? What's the point where you say?
Well, about the time I've realized that Andy has already written it down on his sheet. He's so much more experienced than me. I think both sides know, really, as soon as they answer. I don't think it really slips by anybody. Everyone's been there more than once or twice, figures it out. And in fact, the one or two times where I've really tried to save that one person I really wanted, I had to wipe the head of DPS traffic enforcement or something on there and say, now just because your husband works at DPS, it's not going to affect you in any way on the side, that you can put it out. And she said, no, to be honest, I can't be fair here. DPS trooper is guilty. So it doesn't really work. It didn't work real good for me that time.
But you could use them. I mean, as Mike says,
They get the poison out,
that's
kind of
right.
poison everybody
But you got a
else.
guy and say, well, he's gone. You know, Mike's gonna strike him with his first strike, but let's go in and let him talk some more about that horrible experience he went through with UTPD. Well, he can just talk. So it can be a great deal even though they're goners. They go down in flames, a sacrifice of life.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys next week.
John, like your
Yeah, I'll say those things back. If,
is marked up.
Andy, if you want to see this tape, it certainly is available to you. Mike, we're sending a copy to Ken Oden and to the,
I've already got some resumes out there.
Did you really just spend 15 minutes?
Okay. Keep up, I'll take the deal. Find out about this, what those stress clinic costs. Okay. If you get there early tomorrow morning, we need to be there. Thanks, Andy, appreciate it. Thanks, Mike. Good job. Chubb? Where'd Chubb go? Already gone. Oh, okay.
Say again about being there.